In 1919, Great Britain had just emerged victorious from the First World War and ruled over an even larger empire than before. But in Ireland, many were unhappy with British rule, and over the next 2 years, Irish Republicans won a brutal war of independence. But victory soon gave way to division, and Ireland would be torn apart by an even bloodier civil war. The Irish War of Independence, or Anglo-Irish War, that raged from 1919 to 1921, was rooted in Irish desire for independence from Great Britain. The so-called Irish question had marked UK politics even before Ireland became part of the UK in 1800, and was still a difficult topic in 1914. That year, the British Parliament passed a Home Rule Act, giving Ireland more autonomy within the UK, but the government delayed implementing it when the Great War broke out. Many Irishmen, though, felt that British rule was foreign and unjust and wanted a fully independent republic. Some radical armed groups launched the Easter Rising in 1916 and declared a free Irish government, but British troops crushed them, and London caused outrage by executing many of their leaders. London tried to find a political solution with an all-party Irish convention, but it failed. Then, in the December 1918 election, the Republican Sinn Féin party, with links to the Easter Rising, won 3/4 of the Irish seats in the UK Parliament with support from Ireland's Catholic majority. The mostly Protestant Ulster region, though, supported the pro-UK Irish Unionist Party. Sinn Féin didn't send its representatives to sit in the London Parliament. Instead, leader Raymond de Valera announced an Irish-only parliament called the Dáil. Preparing for conflict, Sinn Féin worked closely with the armed group soon to be known as the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. So in early 1919, a self-declared Irish Parliament allied with the independent IRA, and the Anglo-Irish War soon began. The Dáil sat for the first time on January 21, 1919, and declared independence. We solemnly declare foreign government in Ireland to be an invasion of our national right which we will never tolerate, and we demand the evacuation of our country by the English garrison. The British, though, still controlled Ireland through the Dublin Castle administration and the police, the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC. To Republicans, they were an occupying force, even though most police were fellow Catholics. So on the same day the Dáil declared independence, the IRA ambushed and killed 2 policemen at Solo Headbeg. Sinn Féin had not approved the attack, but it's still often seen as the start of the war, even though London considered it a police matter at first. The IRA now began a guerrilla campaign against the RIC and British officials. They avoided pitched battles and instead ambushed police patrols or barracks with whatever weapons they had, even homemade bombs. The IRA also organized itself into county brigades or parish companies and recruited unit leaders. They also used flying columns of mobile attack groups that could quickly form up, attack, and disappear. This was a tricky process, and there were struggles, but a decentralized structure had advantages. The democratic organization of the volunteers and the impossibility in the circumstances of any tight control by the headquarters staff permitted and encouraged the development of local initiative on a scale quite abnormal in a regular army. To the RIC, the attacks seemed to come out of nowhere, and the attackers melted away into the civilian population. IRA fighter Seamus Conway described a typical ambush. In a brief space of time, 2 lorries approached. The mine, on being exploded, blew the front part off the first lorry, bringing it to a standstill and throwing out the occupants. The second lorry pulled up behind this, and concentrated rifle fire was brought to bear on it. Its occupants jumped and dived for cover, a good many of them knocked out as they did so. Cover at this point was scarce. They got their Lewis gun into operation immediately, but after a few bursts, the gunner was knocked out, and the guns did not get into action anymore. The IRA attacks were small. They killed 15 policemen in all of 1919, but they had a big political impact. Even when the RIC repelled IRA assaults on better defended police barracks, which they usually did, they improved Republican morale and forced the British onto the defensive. The IRA usually chose the time and place of any combat which overwhelmed the RIC, which suffered more casualties than the attackers. So in March 1920, the British created the RIC Special Reserve, better known as the Black and Tans, since they used some army khaki in their dark uniforms. Most were English or Irish Protestants who'd fought in the Great War, although 20% were Catholic. But contrary to popular belief, very few were criminals before joining. Poor training and the pressures of counterinsurgency combat meant that the Black and Tans would commit more crimes than other British soldiers while in uniform. The IRA's guerrilla campaign against the police accelerated in 1920, which also saw escalation from the British side. IRA ambushes became more frequent and more deadly in the second year of the war, killing 143 police. The embattled RIC spent more time in barracks in towns for safety, leaving rural Ireland in the hands of the IRA. The IRA also began an arson campaign that summer, burning over 400 abandoned police barracks and 50 courthouses. Sinn Féin set up a parallel state in the countryside, including Republican courts, police patrols, and taxes. They also brought the British court system to a virtual halt, as witnesses, juries, and even judges refused to participate. This was partly due to Republican sympathies among most Catholics, but also IRA intimidation. One magistrate wrote, "Everybody is yielding to Sinn Féin, whether they approve of it or not. They say they can do nothing else, and that the UK government cannot or will not protect them, and the police can barely protect themselves." London underestimated the Republican movement, but British officers in Ireland took it seriously. Lord George Riddell recorded a conversation with General Lord French. It was absurd to think that the British Army could not quell such an insurrection if given proper powers. French said it was an underground conspiracy. You might pass from one end of Ireland to the other and not see anything abnormal, but the rebel organization was there. British strategy was failing, so they created a new force in July 1920, the Auxiliary Division of the RIC, or Auxies. They're often confused with the Black and Tans, but they were a separate paramilitary force of ex-Great War British officers. Their task was to take the fight to the IRA in the southern counties, and while they were well armed and well paid, they were poorly housed, poorly fed, and poorly organized. The Auxies had some success against the IRA, like capturing 40 prisoners at Kilmashoe in September, but morale was bad and turnover was high. Auxie Ernest Lissett explained the stresses. "We were on dangerous duty, which was to keep the highways and roads open to traffic. Every morning the patrols would leave the castle, all in battle order and ready for trouble on the way. It was very interesting passing through the most beautiful country, but we never knew what was just around the bend." The Auxies and Black and Tans became more known for violence against civilians than for fighting the IRA. They often couldn't find the IRA after an ambush, and many shopkeepers refused to sell to police. So under constant threat of attack, the Auxies and Black and Tans turned to violent reprisals as punishment. After an IRA attack, or simply for perceived Republican sympathies, they shot into homes, looted shops, and burned buildings. Between July and September, there were notable reprisals in Tules, Upperchurch, Limerick, Templemore, Balbriggan, and Tubbercurry. Local resident Mrs. Murricane recounted her experience. "They all seemed to me to speak with an Irish accent. The swearing was awful. The men asked me where my husband was, and I asked him what they wanted him for. They replied, to shoot him." The British officially banned reprisals in August, but officers turned a blind eye, and some encouraged them. "The more you shoot, the better I will like you, and no policeman will get into trouble for shooting a man." The reprisals turned more Irishmen against Britain, but also frightened some into giving the police information. The IRA also pressured civilians to cooperate with them and killed suspected police informants. In general, the Republican side benefited politically from the violence, except in Ulster. There, an attempted Republican economic boycott led to the revival of a Unionist paramilitary organization, the Ulster Volunteer Force. Many northern towns became divided on sectarian lines as Protestants and Catholics fought in the streets and forced each other into separate neighborhoods. So by fall 1920, violence had spread to all parts of Ireland. British police morale was low, but the Auxies had gained some control over Republican areas. In early November, British authorities reported on their progress. Much of the moral and material support lent to Sinn Féin is due to fear, and with the growth of the realization that the government is beginning to get a grip of the situation, there are indications of a return to sanity and revulsion against Sinn Féin on the part of more responsible persons. But the IRA was about to launch its most ambitious attack yet. One strength of the IRA was intelligence. Sinn Féin's secretive Minister for Home Affairs and Director of Intelligence, Michael Collins, had become a legendary figure. He built a network of informers in the British administration and police, using the information to carry out targeted assassinations of British officials. British intelligence, on the other hand, consistently failed in Ireland. They once arrested Collins, but only realized it after they'd already released him. IRA intelligence operative Florence O'Donoghue explained British troubles. One thing the British lacked, which the IRA had in generous measure, was the cooperation of the people, and without it, they were blind and impotent. The British relied on paid informants, a problematic system, but one that did bring some results. Collins decided a dramatic action was needed. The Dáil approved his plan for an IRA group known as the Squad to kill 12 members of British intelligence known as the Cairo Gang in their own homes. On the morning of Sunday, November 21st, 1920, the Squad killed 14 men, including the first 2 Auxies of the war, in an unplanned clash. It's not clear how many of the dead were actually in the Cairo Gang. That afternoon, the British responded, surrounding a crowd watching a Gaelic football match at Croke Park. The police said they wanted to search for IRA agents, but claimed that someone fired at them from the stands, a claim that has never been verified. The Auxies and RIC fired into the crowd, killing 14, including 3 children. At Dublin Castle, British officers executed 3 prominent IRA prisoners. Publicly, the IRA trumpeted Bloody Sunday as a victory. My one intention was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens. If I had a second motive, it was not more than a feeling such as I would have had for a dangerous reptile. By their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. They have destroyed without trial. I have paid them back in their own coin. Privately, though, Collins had doubts as he'd not expected the harsh British response. The events of Bloody Sunday sent a shockwave across Ireland and Britain, but the violence continued even as diplomacy began. Even before Bloody Sunday, the British had been divided about Ireland. General Neville Macready wanted to impose martial law, but Lloyd George refused, saying that one did not declare war on rebels. Instead, in December 1920, London passed the Government of Ireland Act, which foresaw 2 Home Rule systems and 2 Irish parliaments, one for Ulster and one for the rest. But the act didn't satisfy Republicans or Unionists. Lloyd George started secret talks with Sinn Féin's Arthur Griffith, but IRA commanders were planning more ambushes. In County Cork, the Auxies had become complacent. There was always careless talk in the town, and it was easy for the enemy to find out which section we would be patrolling on any day, some days ahead, and make any plans they thought fit. On November 28th, Tom Barry's IRA unit ambushed a convoy of 2 police lorries, killing 16 of 18 Auxies on the spot and 1 later. The IRA accused the police of pretending to surrender before opening fire, a claim that is still debated a century later. The lone surviving policeman, on the other hand, insisted the IRA executed the police after they'd surrendered. The Auxiliary Division had suffered its bloodiest defeat of the war, and the British declared martial law in 4 counties, including this public warning. Note well that a state of armed insurrection exists, that any person taking part therein, or harboring any person who has taken part therein, or procuring, inviting, aiding, or abetting any person to take part therein, is guilty of levying war against His Majesty the King, and is liable on conviction by a military court to suffer death. After another IRA ambush in Cork City, British troops and police torched the city centre in reprisal. Foreign governments condemned the British action, and London paid residents £3 million in compensation. Some Auxies, though, saw it as payback and wore burnt pieces of cork on their caps. The British decided they needed to channel the violence of their forces, so they introduced a system of official, limited reprisals in January 1921. But imposing martial law in part of Ireland did not solve London's problems, like poor morale, complicated British command structure, and infighting between various police, administration, and military services. With Irish elections planned for May 1921, Lloyd George proposed a truce, which the IRA rejected since they would have had to disarm. So both the British and the IRA were facing serious challenges to achieving their aims in the war, but the fighting would be more intense than ever in 1921. Both sides went on the offensive. Britain sent reinforcements and soldiers, and police patrolled aggressively into IRA-controlled territory. The IRA also adapted, with better training and replacing the flying columns with smaller active service units. The Dáil also took responsibility for the IRA to smooth tensions and improve ammunition and weapons procurement. At first, the spike in violence in 1921 led to British success. Several IRA raids went badly, and at Clonmelt, the British killed 8 and arrested 12. Police and soldiers also seized IRA weapons, leading to a critical shortage. But politically, the violence still benefited the Republican cause. In March, they planned an ambush to kill British Lieutenant General Strickland. 70 IRA men under Sean Moylan and Paddy O'Brien attacked the British convoy with mines and machine guns. Our men opened fire on the leading lorry and stopped it by killing the driver. The second lorry pulled up, and the touring car and armored car almost dashed into it. The rear lorry came on until stopped by our rifle fire. There must have been a big roll of casualties in this car, as a very effective fire was poured into it from the north and west. After a 2-hour fight in which the enemy machine guns searched the whole countryside and which finally developed into a series of skirmishes over a large area, we retreated in good order after inflicting heavy casualties and without suffering any on our side. The IRA had killed a British officer, but it wasn't Strickland. It was Brigadier General Hanway Robert Cumming, along with 4 others. It was not as successful as the IRA made it out to be, but it was another blow against the British Army. Such countryside attacks were important, but Republicans knew the political centre was Dublin. The IRA's new Dublin Active Service Unit stepped up small-scale attacks, striking more than 200 times between March and May. De Valera wanted a larger operation, and so on May 25th, IRA units stormed the Dublin Custom House. 120 IRA men set the building on fire, but auxiliaries in an armoured car arrived, killing 6 IRA men and forcing 80 to surrender. Sinn Féin publicly celebrated a victory, but internally, members worried about such heavy losses. The escalation in 1921 left both sides exhausted. The Republicans were militarily weak but politically strong, while the British had the opposite problem. Something had to give. By July, the British had arrested 4,500 IRA men, leaving only 2,000 active IRA fighters in the field. The British even narrowly missed capturing Michael Collins himself, again. Lloyd George, however, acknowledged the reality of majority Republican support outside of Ulster and offered more talks. In July 1921, a fragile truce began. Hardliners on both sides grumbled since they thought that their side was winning, but for Collins at least, it was a necessity. We had not, when these truce terms were offered, an average of 1 round of ammunition for each weapon we had. The fighting area in Cork was becoming daily more circumscribed, and they could not have carried on much longer. London wanted an autonomous Ireland to remain part of the Empire. Sinn Féin leaders were divided between those willing to compromise and those who felt that anything short of a fully independent republic was a betrayal of the cause. Talks bogged down on 2 questions: the status of Ulster and whether an Irish government would have to swear an oath to the crown. Most Republican politicians eventually accepted that Ulster would remain in the UK, and De Valera proposed an oath that recognized an association with the crown rather than loyalty. But De Valera went back on his own draft oath and refused to participate directly in the talks. On December 5th, Britain gave the divided Irish peace delegation in London an ultimatum: accept the latest deal or face renewed war. The delegates thought that they had the authority to sign without consulting De Valera, and did. The final terms represented major compromises by both sides. An Irish Free State would have its own parliament for domestic affairs, enjoy financial independence, and have its own small military. British troops would leave the country, except for 6 of the 9 counties in Ulster, which chose to remain in the UK. The Irish Free State was still a part of the British Empire, and the Parliament had to swear an oath to the Crown. The Irish War of Independence took the lives of around 260 British soldiers, 360 police, 550 IRA fighters, and 200 civilians. But the peace caused a political crisis in the Free State. De Valera and other hardliners bitterly opposed the treaty, and Republicans split into pro- and anti-treaty factions. Just before the Dáil ratified the treaty in January 1922, De Valera made an ominous prediction. If the treaty was accepted, the fight for freedom would still go on, and the Irish people, instead of fighting foreign soldiers, would have to fight the Irish soldiers of an Irish government set up by Irishmen. They would have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of the soldiers of the Irish government, and through perhaps the blood of some of the members of the government in order to get Irish freedom. Ireland had just won partial independence, but the Irish Free State was on the brink of civil war. Irish political and military leadership was now bitterly split into 2 factions. The anti-treatyists rejected the deal and were led by Eamon de Valera, who'd resigned as president after Parliament narrowly approved the treaty. The most prominent of the pro-treatyists was Michael Collins. He claimed the treaty was not perfect, but was a stepping stone for full independence later on. The pro-treatyists established a provisional government in Dublin and wanted to implement the treaty quickly. They claimed that they had overwhelming public support, and although anti-treaty politicians blocked a plebiscite on the issue, 24 of 26 Southern Irish city councils did pass resolutions in favour of the treaty. Sinn Féin founder Arthur Griffith now became president, and Collins chairman of the provisional government. The anti-treatyists, led by De Valera, refused to accept the new government, claiming it had no authority to disestablish the republic that had been announced in the 1916 Easter Rising. The IRA also split into pro- and anti-treaty factions. Much of the experienced leadership of the General Headquarters supported the treaty, but they had limited control of IRA units in the field. Of the 16 IRA commands in Ireland, only 5 wholly or largely supported the treaty. The southwestern region of Munster soon became the anti-treaty heartland. Tensions were increasing, and violence between rival groups was barely avoided in February 1922. The split in the IRA was further exacerbated when the provisional government created an official armed forces, the National Army. The army was based on the British model of a conventional force, and the pro-treatyists attempted to portray it as the successor of the IRA. In March, the anti-treaty forces held a series of banned IRA conventions and formed a new army executive separate from the National Army. With about 2/3 of IRA brigades represented, the executive claimed it would no longer answer to Dublin. The new group elected 1st Southern Division Commander Liam Lynch as its leader. That's not to say all IRA cooperation stopped. Anti- and pro-treaty leaders, including Lynch and Collins, continued to work together in the partitioned Northeast as late as April 1922. Both factions did make plans for a united offensive against British control, but they were never acted upon. So as rival Irish governments and armies formed, the British quickly and quietly left the territory of the future Irish Free State. The departing Brits handed over barracks and equipment to whichever IRA brigade controlled the region, and often the British left behind a power vacuum. Law and order in Ireland quickly began to suffer after the British forces left. Sectarian violence, agrarian agitation, strikes, robberies and looting all became more common. Republican unity had largely kept the peace during the Anglo-Irish War, but this was beginning to unravel. Pro-treaty minister Kevin O'Higgins described the difficult position of the provisional government. Simply 8 young men in the city hall stand amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundations not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. No police force was functioning throughout the country, no system of justice was operating, the wheels of administration hung idle, battered out of recognition by the clash of rival jurisdictions. Talk of civil war was also becoming more frequent, including from former President De Valera in March. The treaty barred the way to independence with the blood of fellow Irishmen. It was only by civil war after this that they would get their independence. If you don't fight today, you will fight tomorrow. And I say, when you are in a good fighting position, then fight on. Some members of the IRA executive, led by Rory O'Connor, decided to act while the provisional government was weak. On April 14th, around 180 men of the Dublin No. 1 Brigade occupied the Four Courts in Dublin, the nation's most important judiciary building. Clearly reminiscent of the Easter Rising in 1916, the move was designed to undermine the authority of pro-treatyists in their capital, and perhaps provoke British reaction, which could potentially reunite the IRA against their mutual enemy. At the same time, though, De Valera and Collins were attempting to reconcile. Both suggested putting forward a unified Sinn Féin in the coming election in June, but the plans soon broke down amid suspicion from both sides. The British claimed it was tantamount to refuting the treaty. When the election results came in on June 16th, pro-treaty Sinn Féin won a convincing victory with 58 seats to the anti-treatyists' 32. Britain now put pressure on the provisional government to end the Four Courts occupation, which had been going on since April. Then, on June 22nd, two IRA gunmen, both former soldiers in the British Army, assassinated British Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson in London. The British government stated that if the Irish provisional government could not impose order, British forces would return to Ireland and do it themselves. Winston Churchill made his position clear in the House of Commons. The presence in Dublin of a band of men styling themselves the headquarters of the Republican executive is a gross breach and defiance of the treaty. The time has come when it is not unfair, premature, or impatient of us to make to the strengthened Irish government and new Irish Parliament a request in express terms that this sort of thing must come to an end. If it does not, then we shall regard the treaty as having been formally violated. With the British gone but threatening to return, and the Four Courts still occupied by anti-treatyists, the Irish Provisional Government's new National Army issued an ultimatum on June 28, 1922. If the occupiers wouldn't leave, the army would open fire. During their 2-month occupation, the IRA had done little to fortify the Four Courts building or develop defences, partly out of a desire not to provoke the National Army. There were also no plans to assist the garrison if it was attacked, and they didn't occupy the surrounding buildings either. IRA leader Ernie O'Malley estimated he needed 70 more men to fully defend the large building. Still, the IRA were armed with rifles, automatic weapons, mines, and the Mutineer, a Rolls-Royce armoured car. In the early hours of June 28th, Major General Emmett Dalton of the National Army issued an ultimatum to the Four Courts occupiers: surrender or face bombardment from his British-supplied 18-pounder field gun. The IRA refused, and so at 4:30 a.m., after a misfire reportedly rectified by a kick, the National Army fired the first shells at the Four Courts. The Irish Civil War had begun. As the bombardment started, National Army troops cordoned off the area and probed closer, but their inexperience began to show. They were reluctant to assault the building, and British General Neville Macready suggested that the artillery was more useful as a morale booster than an actual weapon. I agreed to send Dalton 50 rounds of shrapnel, which was all we had left, simply to make a noise through the night, as he was afraid that if the guns stopped firing, his men would get disheartened and clear off. About every quarter of an hour during the night, a shrapnel broke up against the walls of the Four Courts, making much noise, but doing no harm. British civil servant Alfred Cope was equally unimpressed with the fighting. This is not a battle. Rory is in the Four Courts. Free Staters are in the houses opposite, each firing at the other hundreds of rounds with probably remarkably few hits. A few hundred yards away, the people carry on their ordinary business. The next day, the IRA tried to relieve the Four Courts garrison from outside Dublin, but efforts were poorly organised and blocked by the National Army. But a smaller group of IRA fighters were able to occupy several hotels along O'Connell Street, later called the Block. They were soon joined by anti-treaty leaders including De Valera, former Defence Minister Cathal Brugha, and Lynch. However, these new positions could do little to support the Four Courts. On June 30th, National Army troops stormed the Four Courts with fixed bayonets. During the short fight that ensued, a huge explosion damaged the public archives, destroying hundreds of years of Irish records. There is debate about whether this was caused deliberately by IRA mines or munitions being hit by artillery. In any case, the explosion marked the surrender of the Four Courts. The National Army now turned to the Block, where the morale of IRA fighters like Emmett Humphreys was weakening. We were becoming more and more frustrated at the fact that we were achieving nothing whatsoever. Some IRA men talked about going down as martyrs, but few were enthusiastic. Instead, De Valera and others were smuggled out of the city before the Bloc surrendered on July 5th. Brugha, however, charged out into the street where National Army troops shot him down. The storming of the Four Courts was a disaster for the IRA. 12 of the executive's 16 members were there, and Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Tom Barry, and others were arrested. Liam Lynch was captured, but later released on the promise that he would not continue the fight, a promise he soon broke. The occupation had not resulted in a surge in public support or sympathy for the Republican movement. By the end of the siege, 65 combatants and civilians had been killed and 281 wounded. Perhaps the most important political consequence, however, was that the Dublin battle clarified the civil conflict. It was now the Irish Free State versus Irish Republicans. The Free State had defeated the Republicans at the Four Courts, but the Irish Civil War was far from over. Despite the Four Courts debacle, the IRA still seemed to hold a military advantage. In July, the Free State announced an expansion of the National Army to 35,000 men, but many of these were young, raw recruits attracted by regular pay. The Dublin Guard, made up of IRA veterans and former Dublin Fusiliers, would become the shock troops of the National Army. But what the National Army lacked in experience, it made up for in firepower. Britain provided the Free State Army with rifles, Lewis guns, revolvers, grenades, machine guns, artillery, trucks, armoured cars, and even aircraft. The Free State government also instructed the media to reinforce it as the legitimate government of Ireland. The army must always be referred to as the Irish Army, the National Army, National Troops, or simply Troops. The IRA irregular forces must not be referred to as the executive forces, nor described as forces or troops. They are to be called bands or bodies. The Free State estimated around 12,900 IRA fighters were still active, especially in the southwest. Many of these were veterans of the Anglo-Irish War, although their quality had been diluted by new arrivals following the truce, and they only had one rifle for every 2 men. Nonetheless, 3/4 of the country could be considered anti-treaty territory, and the largest and most experienced IRA divisions, the 1st and 2nd Southern, were strongly anti-treaty. Given IRA weakness, Lynch ordered his units back to their home turf to take over pro-treaty barracks and towns. But some IRA leaders, like Seamus Robinson, told Lynch he was being too cautious. Liam, it's absurd to stay in your own areas, for they'll take you piecemeal. In reality, there was little central control over IRA forces. In July, the National Army began to advance to prevent a rival government from forming in Munster. The IRA abandoned County Wexford, and Lynch tried to form a defensive line running from Limerick to Waterford. But the line was an illusion. There were few defensive positions, and the IRA rarely even contested it. On July 20th, the National Army captured Limerick after a short battle, breaking communications between the IRA in Munster and the north. Waterford fell soon afterwards, followed by Westport, Carrick, Redmondstown, and Clonmel by early August. IRA successes were limited to clearing a couple of towns of their pro-treaty garrisons. In most cases, the IRA withdrew in the face of overwhelming firepower and only fought pitched battles around the villages of Brewery and Kilmallock. In early August, General Dalton shifted his strategy to focus on weak IRA coastal defenses. On August 8th, National Army troops landed at Union House and Youghal in amphibious assaults, which were diversions for the main landing at Passage West near Cork. Exhausted IRA fighters like Frank O'Connor struggled to mount a coherent defense. Technically, a landing from the sea is supposed to be one of the most difficult military operations, but as we handled the defense, it was a walkover. On August 10th, the National Army took the IRA stronghold of Cork, followed by the last IRA military base at Fermoy. After a string of National Army victories, the so-called Munster Republic was over, and some IRA men began to talk of surrender. Instead, Lynch ordered his forces to form flying columns and conduct guerrilla operations. This was a return to their old methods and led to new successes. On August 22, 1922, Michael Collins toured the southwestern regions recently captured by the National Army, despite warnings from his colleagues. Officially, he went to inspect the troops, but oral evidence suggests that he wanted to start peace talks with the IRA. In the early hours, Collins and General Dalton left Cork in a convoy consisting of a motorcycle scout, a Crossley tender, a touring car, and an armoured car bringing up the rear. When passing through a valley, the convoy asked a local for directions. Unbeknownst to Collins, that local was also an IRA sentry who recognized Collins and informed his unit. Assuming the convoy might use the same route to return, the IRA blocked the road with a cart and mined it to prepare the ambush. But by 8 p.m, the convoy had not returned, and most of the ambushing party left. 5 men remained to dismantle the blockade, but just as they got started, the convoy arrived. The IRA men launched an impromptu ambush. Dalton told Collins to drive straight through, but instead, Collins ordered his men out to fight. The resulting firefight lasted 30 minutes, during which the armoured car's machine gun jammed. Towards the end of the skirmish, Collins rose from cover with his rifle in hand and was fatally shot in the head. He was the only casualty on either side. Michael Collins' death is perhaps the single most controversial moment of the Irish Civil War, and who fired the fateful bullet is still hotly debated. The most common suspect is IRA man and former British Army marksman Sonny O'Neill, but there are other theories as well. Some Republican historians suggest that he was killed by his own entourage, even by Dalton himself, because Collins wanted to make peace with the IRA. Some have said that De Valera set up the hit, and others point to the Scottish gunner on the National Army armoured car, since he later joined the IRA. Many of these theories first arose long after the event, based on statements from people who were not there at the time. In any case, Collins, the most influential of the pro-treatyists, was now dead. So the Free State had lost one of its leaders, but the National Army still held the upper hand, and now it cracked down on the IRA harder than ever before. After Collins' death, W.T. Cosgrave replaced him as chairman of the Provisional Government. Originally, the British were doubtful about the civilian Cosgrave, but he soon proved a willing commander. Collins had largely been reluctant to instigate harsher policies against the IRA, many of whom were his former colleagues. Cosgrave, however, would have few such reservations. From August, the war began to resemble the Anglo-Irish conflict that had come before it, a reality that General Dalton recognized. The IRA have now adopted a type of warfare of which they have years of experience. They now operate over territory which they know. They are now better armed and better trained than when they were against the British. In short, they have placed me and my troops in the same position as the British were a little over a year ago. In August alone, the National Army lost 58 men in IRA ambushes, and it now became harder to strike back at IRA groups. As the war began to resemble an insurgency, National Army troops became frustrated. Often the IRA would fire the first volleys in an attack, kill or wound soldiers, and then immediately surrender before the National Army could fire back. In such circumstances, commanders reported it was hard to prevent their troops executing prisoners. Pressure mounted on Cosgrave to allow the official execution of captured fighters as a deterrent to such tactics. The result in October was the Army Special Powers Resolution. It allowed the military to establish special courts to try suspected IRA fighters and execute them if necessary. Commander-in-Chief Richard Mulcahy had a blunt message for the Irish Parliament. Life must be taken if necessary, and it is the responsibility of the government to say that it must be taken. Even the Catholic Church lent their support to the Free State. Captured IRA fighters were to be denied communion, and an official pastoral statement made the Church position clear. The guerrilla warfare now being carried on by the irregulars is without moral sanction, and therefore the killing of national soldiers in the course of it is murder before God. In response, Lynch ordered the assassination of all parliamentarians who voted for the resolution, but the attacks were immediately answered by the firing squad. In November, the first executions based on the resolution were carried out. Eventually, high-ranking Republican figures like Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, and Erskine Childers were executed, supposedly in response to IRA attacks. The brutal government policy seemed to work, since Lynch abandoned his assassination attempts in December. The government resolution allowed for official reprisals, which also became increasingly common. The Dublin Guard gained a grisly reputation in Kerry for its brutality, including executing IRA prisoners with mines. However, unlike British reprisals in the Anglo-Irish War, the National Army usually directed their attacks against specific individuals and not entire communities. The IRA's guerrilla campaign in late 1922 began to flounder in the face of government executions, and the Republican cause was in trouble. By early 1923, IRA morale had plummeted and men were already disbanding and returning home. Politically as well, the anti-treaty side was in tatters. De Valera was increasingly sidelined by military leaders and failed to form a viable political alternative to the Free State. Meanwhile, as the National Army shifted to cordon and search operations, more IRA fighters and leaders were arrested or killed. On April 10th, National Army troops fatally wounded Liam Lynch himself in County Waterford. By the time of his death, 12,000 IRA fighters were in custody. Lynch's replacement, Frank Aiken, understood that the struggle was now over. On May 24, 1923, he ordered all remaining Republican units to ditch their weapons and go home. De Valera's joint statement suggested future operations might be possible, but in reality, the Irish Civil War was over. Further struggle on your part would now be in vain, and the continuance of the struggle in arms is unwise in the national interest. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. By the end of the fighting, about 750 pro-treaty troops had been killed, along with a similar number of anti-treatyists, at least 78 of whom were executed by the Free State. It's likely that more people died in the Irish Civil War than the War of Independence that preceded it. So why did the IRA, who seemed so effective against the British, fail against the National Army barely a year later? Historians have suggested several reasons. Firstly, the IRA, a mostly irregular formation, was unsuited to position warfare or defensive battles. Liam Lynch's decision not to push on Dublin has been criticised, as it gave the provisional government time to breathe, receive British support, and take out isolated IRA brigades. Many National Army officers were former IRA men themselves, so they understood IRA tactics and even knew the locations of safe houses and weapons caches. The Four Courts occupation has also been highlighted as naive, wasteful, and poorly executed. Even at the time, IRA commanders were criticized for acting like common soldiers, with many being captured as a result. But perhaps the most critical issue for the IRA was a lack of public support. The Four Courts occupation did not get the sympathy of the Easter Rising of 1916, and throughout the Civil War, IRA commanders complained of local hostility in some regions. Anti-treaty leader Harry Boland admitted that the population was against them. There is no doubt that the people, in the main, is against us at present, believing that we are to blame for the present state of affairs. Some of the public opposition to the IRA was based on the dire economic situation. Many of the anti-treaty regions were those most economically damaged by the Anglo-Irish War, and IRA activities and the need to raise finances limited economic recovery. IRA attacks on railways in particular earned public scorn. For a sizable portion of the public, the Free State seemed to be the only institution capable of providing security, peace, and economic recovery after years of conflict. The IRA was no longer the face of popular rebellion, and although attritional guerrilla tactics worked against a perceived foreign occupier, they were much less effective against a government largely seen as legitimate. But the end of the Civil War was not the end of violence, especially in the partitioned North. Sectarian violence and assassinations would continue, even after Ireland gained full independence from Britain in 1937. In the 1960s, rival paramilitary organizations, some of whom claimed continuation from the IRA, would engage in a 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland simply called the Troubles. Only in 1998, after nearly a century of violence, the Good Friday and Belfast agreements brought peace to Ireland that has lasted for more than 20 years. Since you made it to the end of this video, you're probably a fan of detailed history documentaries. We actually produced 3 documentary series with a combined runtime of more than 9 hours. 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45 feature the last battles of World War II in Europe, and our series Red Atoms breaks down the Soviet nuclear program from its origins to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond. Unfortunately, we couldn't upload these series to YouTube, where we have to navigate advertising guidelines and the almighty algorithm. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin, Rhineland 45, and Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators where we don't have to worry about advertising guidelines or the almighty algorithm. Nebula is available in 4K resolution in your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. Right now, you can also get the Nebula Lifetime membership. Pay once and get access to everything Nebula has to offer for as long as you and Nebula exist. The Lifetime membership allows us to invest in more original content and improve the platform for everyone. 1/3 of your Lifetime membership will also support us at Real Time History directly. If you go to nebula.tv/The Great War, you can watch 16 Days in Berlin, our other original documentaries, Rhineland 45 and Red Atoms, as well as a host of other smart creators. And all that for just $36 for an entire year. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is an underground conspiracy.